In one of the most catastrophic natural disasters of the last 100 years, images like these of people swept up in the grip of nature spurred many Canadians from all walks of life to donate generously to aid organizations to help others in their time of need. But these media images and the subsequent coverage of rising numbers and lost relatives and livelihoods did not tell the whole story.
I think that clearly suffering, pain, death, mass destruction make good copy, so they sell easily. People are interested in those images, and I think people are particularly interested in those images because they reinforce what they already think that they know. And that's not particularly productive. On the one level, it's useful because when you need to mobilize money on a short-term basis, unfortunately, those types of images get people moved. In the longer term, those kinds of images can be numbing, and people don't recognize that there's real pain and real suffering behind those pictures.
Canadians responded very much as the rest of the world to the tsunami disaster. Trade unionists, as well as other individuals and organizations, were eager to give money to a cause that touched their emotions and did not involve moral decisions, as in the case of a war, or for some, in the case of HIV/AIDS. Everyone was an innocent. But giving money to a disaster relief fund is only one step in the understanding of the issues of emergency relief aid and what comes next. All of the countries hit by the tsunami were so-called developing countries, and the people who were hardest hit were the most vulnerable: women, children, and people living in poverty. Solidarity with those affected means offering assistance that is sustainable, appropriate, and locally initiated. But the legacy of colonialism and inequalities of globalization have deliberately kept developing countries poor. Overcoming these twin burdens is a complex and often frustrating task.
Aceh is highly gender segregated society where public domain is all men and women are very much in the domestic domain. So, and the men, most of them, either they're out or they're in the sea. So those who are out or those who are in the sea, they're safe. In areas where it's worse hit, like where we are, if you have 200 survivors, you've got only 20, 30 women.
By and large, they are poor people who are at the moment, their livelihoods are completely disrupted. So most of them are still in what you call camps, temporary camps, still awaiting proper allocation of land and houses for them to go move out.
Much of the damage and the deaths could have been averted if the power of local business elites and transnational developers had not cleared away much of the mangrove swamps to make way for the tourist trade and the shrimp farm industry. The dense-rooted mangrove swamps would have slowed the tsunami down, and the coastal dwellers would have been better protected.
There is now a worrying, again, policy from the government concerning assistance on housing facilities for the survivors. They said that the housing given will be based on the condition before. So for instance, you have 5 houses before, all destroyed, the government will give you the same number of houses. But for the landless and the renters, the government said that they don't lose anything because they didn't have house, they didn't have land. So what they give is only money to rent a house for 3 years. So we're really very angry about this, we're mad at it. So we came to them in big number demonstration. We said to them that, look, this is a good opportunity, at least for Aceh, and that hopefully would be a precedent for Indonesia, that we can take the opportunity or use the opportunity for poverty alleviation, or at least to lessen the social gap by giving first priority to the poorest, to the landless, to the renters. So our demand was that the landless and the renters should be given land and house.
The response within India and also in the West was tremendous. It was, the pictures that were flashed around, and it generated an immediate response. Fishermen who were residing in the coastal areas, they were the worst affected. We are focusing more on a long-term strategy. It is more on skill development, vocational training. And we have to also focus that if we develop any activity, it's not just give money and develop activity. It's very important to sustain that activity also. And it should be people-centered.
In Sri Lanka, Thailand, and Indonesia, the tsunami disaster has led to land grabs along the coastal regions. Naomi Klein calls this part of disaster capitalism, where private money seeks to capitalize on natural disasters as well as war conditions. In these countries, government policies have aided and abetted the removal of coastal inhabitants in favor of local and transnational companies who expand the development of condos, luxury resorts, and more corporate shrimp operations. Sometimes the money received through international aid has facilitated this transfer, using the argument that wealth will trickle down to the poor.
The big concern, obviously and ultimately, is that we shouldn't be relying on humanitarian short-term emergency relief. What we should be looking at is what are the structural issues that underlie Africa's problems and the problems of many developing parts of this world, and what are the issues and areas in which Western countries and Western agencies, particularly the World Bank and the IMF, are complicit in making those problems worse than they actually should be.
I don't find it particularly gratifying to compare the tsunami and HIV and AIDS, mostly because in these comparisons they tend to trade off one for the other. And I'd just as soon view the tsunami as a separate and horrific incident that happened with massive international coverage to which the world responded. HIV and AIDS is a dreadful pandemic eviscerating the southern part of the continent of Africa. HIV and AIDS challenges all of the social and economic advances we're making: poverty, hunger, infant mortality rates, maternal mortality rates, communicable disease, getting kids into school, environmental preservation. All of them are pitched into a cocked hat by the impact of HIV and AIDS.
50,000 people die daily as a result of poverty-related illnesses. It is a sort of silent tsunami that is going on the planet every week of the year, every year that we go through, and we have not addressed it effectively.
Natural disaster that appears somewhere, everybody sees 10,000 people killed, 5,000 people killed. But the AIDS pandemic, in a year, in most countries, kills 30,000 people, but they die one today, one after 3 days, and things like that, but they add up to 30,000. It's called that AIDS. It's actually an emergency requiring urgent action. Because if you look at the disaster being caused in communities where families are breaking down, where children are out of school, and children being out of school means that the whole future of a country is at stake because they are supposed to be the leaders of tomorrow, and there's no foundation for them now. If we don't look at it as an emergency at this level, then by the time that we want to look at it as an emergency, it might be very little we will have to do, because these children would have reached irreparable stages in their lives. The consequences of AIDS really have to be brought to the forefront, to the attention of everybody.
By 2012, there will be 100 million people who have either died or are infected with the virus. There's never been anything like it in the history of humankind, not even the Black Death in the 14th century.
Many unions in countries beset by HIV/AIDS approach the epidemic as a workplace issue, tightly integrating AIDS workshops in their regular health and safety programs funded by Canadian unions. There are also bargaining issues related to AIDS, from non-discrimination to provision of condoms and medication. Both private and public sector workers are affected.
SATU is not only fighting for quality public education for all, but also for the future of the teachers in our country.
Originally, as a union, we worked together with the Department of Education on HIV/AIDS issues, and so we went about to initiate research on looking at the prevalence of HIV/AIDS amongst our educators. The research revealed that 12.7% of our teachers were HIV positive, and that approximately 4,000 teachers were dying a year of HIV. It also indicated that if the government and, well, the unions didn't do anything about it, that within the next 3 years we'd lose something like 10,000 teachers to the disease because they would get full-blown AIDS within the next 3 years.
The women of Africa carry the continent. They do all the work. They get the water, they find the wood for fire, they cook the meals, they do the farming, they take the produce to market and sell it, they sustain the families, they just do everything there is within the community. They are the backbone of the continent. And then, on top of everything else, they assume the entire burden of care. When they fall ill, they look after themselves, they look after their partners. When the partners are ill, they look after the neighbors, the families, and they look after the orphans.
One strategy of reducing or mitigating the impact of HIV and AIDS is to empower the informal sector, and that is what the ZCTU is doing, assisting the women to engage in some small activity so that they can generate an income and avoid the possibility of engaging in unprotected sex through prostitution. I must admit that because of the level of militarization, it has been difficult, but we are doing our best.
One of our programs, which is a microcredit program, we call it Women's Initiative for Education Economic Development, which is involved in giving microcredits to women in villages. And through this project, we were able to develop a program to support infected mothers and caregivers of orphans with interest-free loans through a funding we got from UNAIDS. So we're thinking that with this approach where we're actually trying to get the caregivers involved in business, we are trying to have a more sustainable way of caring for the orphans. And we are very conscious of the fact that other children are going to be benefiting from it as well. I mean, the caregivers also have their own children that they have to take care of as well as these orphans. So we think it's reaching out now more to more people in the community than one-time grants that will be targeting maybe the pressing needs of an orphan for the moment.
The wages and salaries that ordinarily our people are earning at the moment are not enough to sustain a basic family of 4. Because of the economic mismanagement, in terms of drugs availability, there are no drugs in our hospital.
The brutal force of structural adjustment programs is that the bank and the International Monetary Fund impose conditions on countries. And countries, I can think of Malawi and Zambia and Kenya, who want to do certain things, are not allowed to do those things for the benefit of the health sector and the education sector, because the International Monetary Fund says it will breach the conditions we imposed upon you, and therefore you're not allowed to do it.
Unions have been critical of the conditions placed on developing country governments when they ask for loans, conditions that might include privatizing their education or their publicly funded healthcare systems. We think that's unacceptable.
We spend as much as 33% of our total foreign earning to service our debts. And yet, the more we pay, the more we owe. And the result is that the resources available now are not enough to meet those basic social needs sufficient investment in healthcare delivery, sufficient investment in basic infrastructure, in particular, sufficient investment in the educational sector. Because if we are in a knowledge economy, the way to build knowledge is to invest in education. And when the state doesn't have enough resources, these areas tends to come under the first attack, and we then create a vicious cycle.
So in effect, the countries lose their governing autonomy. And in order to counteract that, it is important that civil society be reinforced. One of the ways you do that is to support indigenous NGOs.
I think when it comes to issues such as poverty, HIV/AIDS, something that's ongoing, there hasn't been a kind of concerted effort to get involved on a long-term basis so that programs can sustain themselves.
Sustainable funding, to me, will be the type of funding which originates from the beneficiaries with a need, who actually develop their programs with their own ingenuity, with their own plans, and now come to say, we need support for us to be able to do this.
The donor states of the world, the rich nations who have committed certain amounts of money to help poor nations, have got to step up to the mark and actually meet the targets that they set more than decades ago. Canada is particularly poor in its performance in this respect.
But when there is a big bag like we saw in Tsunami, those figures are set aside, and we begin to see that the world do indeed have the means to put a smile on all those who are dying in poverty, that the world indeed can put a smile on those who are wallowing in ignorance and illiteracy, that the world can put food on the table of those who are starving, and where the rich appreciate the need as a matter of deliberate policy to continuously provide for the poor.
I think many people in the African public gave significantly to the relief efforts in the tsunami. So it was unlike anything that's ever happened, and I don't think we can downplay that or begrudge the outpouring of support that happened for the tsunami. And what was different about the tsunami was that it was a public outpouring. It wasn't government saying, we have an aid program and this is what we're giving you. It was really an emotional response that came from the people of the world. And what would be useful would be to see a similar outpouring from the people of the world around the long-term structural problems that Africa faces.
Like most of the citizens of the world, trade unions and union members have always been ready to offer solidarity. Facing the chaos of global climate change, resource scarcity, the ravages of HIV/AIDS, and the continuing drive for low wages and high profits, solidarity becomes more and more important. Canadian Union's international development work and political activism makes a positive difference to the people on the ground where it counts. We invite you to join us, give us your active support, and promote this work.
As trade unionists, we've always said that what we desire for ourselves, we wish for others. Each of us needs to find out what's being done and how he or she can help get the job done.